Okay, folks, if you're joining us by Zoom, we will be restarting in just a moment. Okay, welcome back to the first afternoon session of the Conference on White Christian Nationalism and the Midterm Elections. And the subject of our second panel is Networks, How is the Christian Nationalist Movement Organized, and how organized is it actually? And we've got three amazing panelists, Katherine Stewart, an investigative journalist, Bradley Onishi, journalist and religious studies scholars at the University of San Francisco, and Ann Nelson, who is a research scholar at Columbia, as well as a journalist. And we're going to kick it off with Katherine.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Phil, for organizing this amazing conference. I want to thank also Lisa and Mohammed for assisting, and I'm so grateful to Yale for providing us with this forum, this place to have this gathering. I'm also so thankful to be with all of my colleagues. I've learned so much from so many of you over the years, and I'm really happy to keep learning. So for too long, America's Christian nationalist movement has been misunderstood and underestimated. Many Americans continue to see it as a cultural movement centered on a set of social issues like abortion or LGBT rights, or preoccupied with a belief in the myth of America's supposedly conservative Christian founding. But Christian nationalism is not just a set of ideas. It's also, this ideology of Christian nationalism is also a tool. I think it's the most useful tool for turning this story into political power. It's a leadership-driven political machine. The movement has already succeeded in degrading our politics and dividing the nation with religious animus. It has embraced authoritarian norms such as scapegoating, the rejection of democratic elections, a refusal to hold its leadership accountable in the face of overwhelming evidence of corruption. This is not a culture war, it's a political war over the future of democracy. Political movements are, by their nature, complex, and this movement is more complex than most. It consists of an extremely well-funded organizational ecosystem that has been built up over decades. The strength of this movement is in that dense organizational infrastructure. I'm going to name some of the features of the infrastructure and name some of the organizations that are involved, but this is by no means a comprehensive list. So there are right-wing policy groups such as the Family Research Council, the American Family Association, Heritage. There are think tanks like Acton Institute and the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. There are legal advocacy organizations like the Alliance Defending Freedom, First Liberty, Liberty Council, the Pacific Justice Institute, and the Federal Society, which is an organization that plays an outsized role in grooming and promoting talent, the sort of talent of people who have the sort of correct, intellectual and partisan kind of orientations. There are networking organizations like the Fellowship Foundation, the Council for National Policy. These organizations serve to get much of the leadership of the movement on the same page. There are legislative initiatives, education initiatives that spread the Christian nationalist story and take aim at public education altogether, very sophisticated data mining operations, and a vast media and messaging sphere, a sector of which actively generates or exploits cultural conflict, cultivates grievance, and promotes disinformation and conspiracism in order to improve its grip on the target population. Some people may question Whether everyone who works for these organizations could be called a quote unquote Christian nationalist, certainly not. But what we can say is that these organizations are lending support to a Christian nationalist agenda. Religious nationalism and authoritarianism are political pathologies that afflict political systems, not just theories that are embraced by millions of supporters. I think this lack of awareness about how the movement works and lack of coverage of this infrastructure leads to a really incomplete understanding of what's happening in our politics today. So for example, we're reading a lot about the conservative justices on the Supreme Court, but we don't read much about the Federalist Society, which is this extremely well-funded organization that played an outsized role in putting those justices on the courts and in shaping the courts, not just the Supreme Court, but other courts as well. All 6 of the current right-wing justices on the Supreme Court have current or former ties to the organization. And a large number of other justices, I think it was 90% of former President Trump's appellate court nominees also had ties to the organization. So here's another example of how the movement is misunderstood. A lot of Republican leaders have become more extreme on a number of issues, but we don't hear much about the Christian nationalist organizations that are pressuring them to support these extreme positions and threatening to mount primary challenges or mounting primary challenges to them if they fail to conform to what the movement leaders want. So in many instances, it's really not the politicians in charge. It's the heads of these different pieces of organizational infrastructure that are really in charge of the kinds of policies that we're seeing in our legislatures and in our courts. Here's another example of how the movement works. Even before the disgraceful attack on our Capitol of January 6th, Trump was spreading these election lies. And they were also, as soon as he started spreading election lies, those lies were picked up and spread by many Christian nationalist leaders and figures through churches, through religious media, through Facebook and podcasts and the like. And we should also consider where some of the most militant and coordinated support for those election lies came from. The Conservative Action Project, which is an organization associated with the Council for National Policy, made its position clear a week before the insurrection. They issued a statement, sort of a memo, calling on members of the Senate to contest the electoral votes from Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and these other states that were the focus of Republicans' baseless allegations. Among the signatories was Cleta Mitchell, who is the Council for National Policy member, who advised Mr. Trump and participated in his call on January 2nd with Brad Raffensperger, Georgia's Secretary of State. This is basically a disinformation exercise, and other signatories to this, on this list included Morton Blackwell of the Leadership Institute, Tony Perkins, president of the Family Research Council, Thomas Fitton of Judicial Watch, and more than a dozen other figures. And so when you see these kinds of memos come down, you can kind of see these different pieces of the infrastructure coordinating on an action. So a lot of the action in our politics is being generated by these organizations, but we really don't hear much about them. We don't hear enough about them. Here's something that's really important to know about the movement. Christian nationalism, it's not a grassroots movement. It's not driven by the attitudes of the rank and file. This is a leadership-driven, organization-driven movement. Its leadership cadre consists of a number of personally interconnected activists, funders, strategists, and politicians, many of whom are involved in multiple initiatives or jump from one initiative to another. I've covered this movement for nearly 15 years. I'm still learning so much about the organizations, which often sometimes shift, funding schemes, denominations, and policy and kinship networks. This is a movement that does adapt continually. The more important thing to know about this movement is that this collective effort is united by a common political vision, not necessarily by any denomination. includes many evangelicals, but it excludes many evangelicals too. And it includes representatives of a variety of both Protestant and non-Protestant religion, and even derives support from some people who are not Christian at all. I want to say something about the funders. I think to an underappreciated degree, a lot of the activity of the movement is driven by money at its core. The movement derives much of its power and direction from a subsection of America's hyper-wealthy class. Many of these mega donors are as committed, if not more committed, to right-wing economic policies that serve the interests of people like them or serve their interests directly, such as low taxation for the rich, minimal regulation of business, minimal or no regulation of the environment, minimal rights for the workforce. And sometimes it seems like this is motivating them as much or more as right-wing positions in the so-called culture wars. A number of these funders belong to extended hyper-wealthy families. There are too many to mention right here. But without them, along with the donor-advised funds, such as the National Christian Foundation, which these other donor-advised funds have channeled billions of dollars in donations anonymously, and the massive flow of right-wing dark money targeting the courts, the Christian nationalist movement in America would not be what it is today. One of the great ironies is this is a movement that claims to support the American family, but it's driving support for politicians whose economic policies are actually making it so much harder for so many American families to succeed. Most Americans, including most American Christians, I believe, reject the politics of conquest and division that this movement represents. But parts of the movement serve as a giant voter turnout machine. And that's one of the reasons why the movement punches above its political weight. I mean, as one of the movement's most sort of seasoned strategists and activists, Ralph Reed has said, you know, pay no attention to the polls, our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. And they have data that shows that they turn out just in disproportionate numbers. But the movement also games the system by putting into place gerrymandering and voter suppression schemes, or as Reed called it cheerfully, the Republican reapportionment advantage that disproportionately targets Black voters and others in Democratic-leaning districts. So, you know, as one of the leaders of a movement that sort of preceded today's religious right, Paul Weyrich said, I don't want everybody to vote. Our influence in election goes up as voting goes down. And then even with this sort of gaming of the vote, they are aware that in many instances, they don't have the numbers that they want. So in recent years, the movement has openly embraced election conspiracism and worked to undermine the electoral system, the integrity of that system. Some leaders outright reject the idea of elections altogether. Some believe that America should be governed by a right-thinking elite, or that conservative Christians of a certain type are called to take control of all functions of American government and society, finance, government, of course, education, media, which they cast as taking dominion back from Satan. The important thing to know about this movement is that it is radically anti-democratic. It pretends to be reviving traditional values, yet its values contradict the principles and norms of our democracy. It has no interest in securing the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. It will happily steal seats and pack the courts in order to get the rulings that it wants. It rejects the consequences of elections that don't go their way. It refuses to hold its chosen leaders accountable to the law, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of corruption. It collaborates with international leaders who seek to undermine the United States' national security and who work to destroy traditional alliances and the post-war world order that has been built up over 7 decades. And again, it claims to defend the family, but treats so many American families with contempt. I want to talk a little bit about the fact that vast numbers of America's conservative or conservative-leaning churches have actually been converted in the minds of movement leaders into loyal cells of a shadow political party. The churches may be fractured in a variety of denominations and theologies, but the leaders have actually had success in uniting them around this vision that they have and mobilizing them to get out the votes for their chosen candidates. They know very well, these leaders know, if you can get people to vote on just 2 or 3 issues, you can control their vote. And they also know that if you get the pastors, you can get like a large section of their congregations. So they draw these pastors into networks and organizations like Watchmen on the Wall or Faith Wins, Church United or Ministros Hispanos and other networks. And they tell these pastors that it is their biblical duty to get their congregations engaged in the political arena, which they sometimes cast as getting them to vote for biblical values. It's a kind of way to avoid, this sort of partisan language that they're not supposed to get involved in. But I've been to gatherings of each of these organizations, and they leave absolutely no question which way these pastors are supposed to get their congregants to vote. At one of the events I attended, a speaker said, "The church is not a cruise ship. The church is a battleship." And that's how they see it. The role of right wing and social media in priming the base for the claim of election fraud is really, I think at this point, pretty well understood. But the role of the faith-based messaging sphere is less well understood. Pastors, congregations, and the religious media, of course, are the most trusted sources of information for a lot of Americans, and many election lies were spread through those channels. So for instance, at that gathering where I heard that the cruise ship church is not a cruise ship, it's a battleship. I was at an event in Chantilly, Virginia, with dozens of pastors in a church. A number of speakers got up there and sort of to get these pastors engaged in an upcoming election. And along with sort of, David Barton and his son talking about the Christian nation myth and other speakers, there was a fellow there named Hogan Gidley, who was a former member of the Trump administration, and he was featured as an elections integrity specialist. And his role there was apparently to spread lies about the election. And he said, "You all saw what happened in Arizona, didn't you?" Well, in Arizona, a Republican-led investigation turned up no evidence of election fraud. But the myth was too valuable for him to discard simply because it's not true. So I want to talk about something that's closely related to the issue of politicized churches and faith-based organizations. Just as important to the pursuit of private money to Christian nationalism is the effort to secure public funding for its schools, for its churches, for its initiatives, its policy groups, through vouchers and other schemes. This is most obvious perhaps in the arena of public education, but calls for religious freedom characterize much of the movement's activism today are as loud and passionate as they are because they are related to this demand for public subsidies. Often they say, no, we just really want the right to, discriminate against people who live unbiblical lifestyles, right? But often it's really, when you look beyond that, yes, of course they want the right to discriminate. They want the government to have, licensed discrimination against subgroups of which they disapprove, but they're also, making a bid for increased amounts of public cash. I think perhaps the most salient impediment to our understanding the movement is the fact that we call Christian nationalism, we also often call it a conservative ideology. The movement is frankly more accurately described as radical, authoritarian. A genuinely conservative movement would seek to preserve institutions of value. It would hold its leaders accountable to the law. It would prize the integrity of electoral politics, the legitimacy of the judiciary, the importance of public education, and the values of equality and mutual respect that represent the best of the American promise. So I'm going to stop talking now. I'm really excited to be on this panel with my fellow panelists, and look forward to hearing from you guys and to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Next up is Ann Nelson.
Thank you. And yes, Catherine and I have been research friends, and I will say that many of you have been Twitter research friends, and it is deeply thrilling to meet you in 3 dimensions. This subject and this place have personal meaning for me. 50 years ago, I was singing in a talent contest at Woolsey Hall down the road, and I'd brought a gospel songbook from my great-grandfather's Nebraska radio show to sing with my quartet. We heard a bass voice behind us, and it was William Sloane Coffin, one of the great progressive voices of American Protestantism. So it was a moment that was a departure from my youth and childhood in the Midwest, where we had quite an array of religious practice. Our family literally included Methodist, Catholics, Calvinists, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and a Jewish branch. So when William James wrote about varieties of religious experience, that was Thanksgiving. So looking at the way that this movement has come about, I also bring the experience of coming from Oklahoma. And when I left, it was a democratic state that had just started to become purple. And now, as many of you know, it's the reddest state in the nation. And there was no obvious reason that religion and denomination should have been the driver for that as of the 1970s, when Jimmy Carter, as a Southern Baptist, won the Democratic nomination and the presidency. So what happened after that? Well, as it turns out, that period was very crucial. In 1980, David Koch ran for vice president as a libertarian, and his platform was no rules about anything. Prostitution, all drugs, any kind of behavior you could imagine would be permitted as long as he didn't have to pay taxes. And of course, that meant the elimination of social welfare programs and public services as well. They got less than 1% of the vote, so they went back to the drawing board. More or less simultaneously, a group of fundamentalist pastors decided to get behind Ronald Reagan and struck what they felt was a certain set of bargains with him. And in 1981, they co-founded the Council for National Policy as a means of implementing their policy desires. And it is not a coincidence that they joined forces with a number of individuals from the fossil fuels industries. So really, from the beginning, this iteration of this movement has been joined at the hip between fundamentalists and fossil fuels interests, as well as other economic interests, such as the DeVos family from the Amway fortune in Michigan. Now, the architects of this movement were Paul Weyrich, who really was looking for ways to create organizations such as ALEC and the Heritage Foundation, as well as the Council for National Policy. Richard Viguerie, who basically invented mass marketing by mail for democratic practice, or for electoral practice. And Morton Blackwell, who formed the Leadership Institute, which claims to have trained and networked over 200,000 candidates and campaign leaders. And all of these men were kind of refugees from the Goldwater campaign. They were deeply disappointed at the loss. They said, all right, how do we reverse this tide of history? Because, by the way, it looks as though demographically, the United States is moving in the opposite direction. It's going to become more youthful, more diverse, with less of a Christian white majority. And how do we stop it? By looking at electoral means, whether it's fair means or foul. And harking back to Samuel Goldman's comments about the manifesto, that's an echo of a manifesto that Weyrich oversaw around this time, where he said, what we have to do is take control and create parallel silos of culture. entertainment, education, media, etc. And if we play those levers of control combined with the religious institutions and play them strategically in states that the Democrats tend to overlook because they think they're boring. The Democrats don't want to be looking at Oklahoma and Indiana and the various other states that end in vowels. So you have this organization that takes shape, and they harness strategists such as Ralph Reed. And in 1997, Ralph Reed joins forces with Tim Phillips, who becomes the head of the so-called grassroots organization, Americans for Prosperity. And you have these two groups harnessed in a logistical way. They created, or they harnessed, their media organizations as well. One of them was Salem Media, which is really not adequately understood in our culture. And it's partly because those of us who live on the coast will probably not encounter Salem Media unless you drive cross country, in which case you'll encounter it on the radio quite often, and people who live there will find it online, etc. And there is unidirectional messaging that goes out in the guise of news, not just on Salem Media, but it's online partners, it's broadcasting partners such as the Christian Broadcasting Network from Pat Robertson, and this whole array of messaging organizations. Now they present as news, they sit at a desk and they have chyrons and they look, they wear nice suits, but they do not practice journalism in any recognizable form. Facts are a little shaky. They don't have opposing opinions. They don't really do anything that legitimate journalists do. They serve to promote their interests. So they were very upset when Obama won the presidency for so many reasons. He was their nightmare. I mean, a Black immigrant Democrat, just the list goes on and on. And the Kochs really stepped up their operations in 2010 by funding a major data collecting organization called I360. And they made very, very sophisticated political and consumer data available to chosen candidates at a highly subsidized rate. At the same time, this data was networked into cell phone apps that were made available to canvassing organizations, including partners in the Council for National Policy, the Susan B. Anthony Anti-Abortion Organization, the National Rifle Association, and the Democrats were really caught blindsided. They didn't have anything like that. The whole structure of their data and political apps operations have fallen behind, and they've never quite yet caught up. So you have these organizations going on, more or less not very visible, I would say, to news organizations on the two coasts, especially on the East Coast. And when my book came out in 2019, I had some pushback saying, well, if the Council for National Policy were important, why haven't I heard of it? That started to change drastically on January 6th, when various members of the Council for National Policy were highly visible in the efforts of both the January 6th protests and insurrection, as well as the maneuvers around the elections, not just Cleta Mitchell, but also Council for National Policy members Ginny Thomas, Mrs. Clarence Thomas, Jenny Beth Martin, head of the Tea Party Patriots, Charlie Kirk was another, and then there was Dr. Simone Gold, who's run their COVID disinformation project. So they have obviously been very important. And one of the keys to their success is that they understand the electoral map very well. They understand the importance of battleground states, including the ones that are in the middle of the country that end in vowels, that the Democrats can't be bothered with, or that they take for granted. They also have had a massive success in networking donor networks. So as it happens, the Koch-founded Donors Trust is headed by Lawson Bader. He's a new member of the Council for National Policy. The National Christian Foundation is a mammoth dark money organization. The DeVos family is central to it. You also have various foundations from family foundations. The Charles Koch Foundation has funded them, the DeVos family, the Bradley family foundations, it goes on and on. Now, if we want to interrogate the question of Christian nationalism, we have to look at a new entrant, Barry Seid, a Jewish and businessman from Chicago who's funded a lot of Israel linked activities, who has just put $1.6 billion with a B into Leonard Leo's project with the Marble Freedom Trust. So this is going to be the big player on the block. And Leonard Leo, of course, is a longtime Council for National Policy member and leader and Federalist Society leader in the past. So there is a lot going on here that transcends the boundaries of Christian nationalism. Another question that has to be examined is the role of African-American leaders in this movement. One of these is E.W. Jackson, a pastor in Virginia. And in the February 2022 Council for National Policy meeting, he held kind of a victory lap talking about how much he boosted Black votes for Glenn Youngkin in Virginia. And they did it by blanketing urban, i.e. Black radio stations in various municipalities of Virginia. And he noted that Pew has said that 80% of Black voters are churchgoers. So you have this audience that's there. And in many of these congregations, you have doubts about same-sex marriage and abortion, which they are recognizing and exploiting. And again, another factor here is that the Democrats have traditionally ignored radio as a powerful medium. And in fact, it has a great deal of influence, especially in certain communities in the United States. You could, if you wanted to, extrapolate from that to the Mexican-American voters in the Rio Grande Valley. So you have both something like a 5% loss of Black male voters to the Democrats from 2016 to 2020. You have a parallel loss among Mexican Americans in the Rio Grande Valley. And Trump is partly responsible for these gains, but not exclusively, because his messaging has been played a role as well. Ralph Reed and Steve Bannon have announced that they plan to build out operations and recruit conservative Catholics. They've been doing this through sophisticated geofencing approaches, again, marshaling the digital technology in a very sophisticated way. And what have they achieved? Well, they've achieved a lot of their goals. They cut a deal with Trump saying that they wanted their organizations to provide him with a list of nominees for federal judiciary appointments. And Trump has satisfied that and appointed not just Supreme Court justices, but lower courts as well. And we're seeing the results right now on a kind of weekly basis, not just abortion, but also voter suppression, gerrymandering, and environmental protections. And I think that we really need to include in our vision what is going on the economic front, because of course, for the Koch operations, environmental protections and tax policy are going to be of primary importance. Looking ahead, what do you have? Well, they've got something called the precinct strategy, which is seeking to purge local Republican precinct leaders and replace them with MAGA representatives. And they've done that on a massive scale. They also are looking at the independent state legislature doctrine, which would utilize Republican state legislatures to, in some cases, overturn elections, possibly. Looking ahead, the Republicans are now projected to win the House of Representatives. The latest polling is showing at least a 20-seat lead, and the Senate either deadlocked or showing a slight Republican majority. So they've announced that if they do win Congress, they will paralyze the Biden administration. They will perhaps seek to impeach Biden and Kamala Harris and start to reverse various policies, including tax policies, back to the Trump policy, which was the most regressive tax policy in our lifetime. So here we have this question of elections coming up, where they are being defined in the critical states, and I would say Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Nevada, by just the slenderest of margins. The Arizona legislature became Republican by a margin of 1,000 votes, right? Biden won the Electoral College by 44,000 votes in 3 states. That number is less than the population of my hometown of Stillwater, Oklahoma. So the question I put before you is, as we, as an academic and journalistic community, analyze Christian nationalism, what do we want to represent to the electorate? Do we want to allow voters in critical swing states who don't read our textbooks to look at the word Christian and say, well, I'm a swing voter and I'm Christian, is that a problem? Do we want them to enter into the problem of what is nationalism, what is patriotism? I'd like to remind you that 54% of American adults read at less than the 6th grade level. So the idea that they're going to be reading what we write is not necessarily a good prediction. And I will close by reading a short quote. On terminology. Words matter. The terminology that senior government officials must accurately identify the nature of the challenges that face our generation. It's critical that all Americans properly understand the gravity of the threats that we face and prepare themselves to take the steps necessary to build a secure future. We are facing an enemy that holds a totalitarian ideology and seeks to impose that ideology through force across the globe. We must resist complacency. The language that senior government officials use can help to rally Americans to vigilance. At the same time, the terminology should also be strategic. It should avoid helping those who would mobilize religious bases and the glamorous appeal of their ideology. One of the most common concerns expressed by Muslims in America, and indeed the West, is that government officials and commentators in the mass media regularly indict all Muslims for the acts of a few. They argue that terminology can create either a negative climate in which acts of harassment or discrimination occur, or by contrast, a positive climate. So words do matter. I do believe that Christian nationalism exists. I also argue that it exists within a broader context in which many of the drivers are economic and the political lust for power, which has always been with us. So looking ahead and to the preservation of our nation and our democracy, it may be important to think more tactically as well as dedicating our thoughts to academic precision. Thanks.
Well, I just want to say, along with Katherine and Ann, what an honor it is to be part of this conference. Thanks to Phil. And like you said, Ann, so many of you have been fellow travelers for the last couple of years, and it's fantastic to meet so many of you in person. I want to talk about, we're talking about networks. I want to talk about a network related to Christian nationalism that it comes from a part of the country we may talk about even less than some of the states Ann just talked about. And that's up in Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, Eastern Washington, Eastern Oregon. I grew up in Orange County, California, the same town where Richard Nixon was born. I attended the church where Nixon's parents raised him. Some of you who study the religious right will know through the work of Lisa McGurr and Darren Dochuk and John Compton and Gerardo Marty that Orange County is not only a hub of conservative religion and politics, the Bible Belt of the Southland, as some call it, but one of the places that millions of Southerners and Midwesterners moved in the mid-20th century, including my mother and her family, in what's known as the Sun Belt migration. However, when I go home to Orange County, it's clear to me that there's another migration happening, and this is what I call the Make America Great migration. If I were to gather everyone that I know from church and from high school who now lives in Idaho, the numbers would be in the triple digits. I could probably have a high school reunion in Boise and have a pretty good turnout. So this migration is not limited to my circles. Boise, and this data is actually a little bit old, has seen about a 9.3 increase in population since 2010. It's gone from flyover country to what many consider the hottest metro area west of the Mississippi. Try buying a house in Boise right now for anything what you might consider affordable, and you won't have much luck. In 2018, so this is before the pandemic, 80,000 Californians moved to the Gem State. Boise State political scientist Jeffrey Lyons found in a study that the Californians moving to Idaho are by percentages more conservative than the state itself as a whole. He says, if anything, Californians coming to Idaho are more conservative than native Idahoans. So instead of turning Idaho blue, the new migrants are reinforcing and transforming Idaho's staunch conservatism. My argument is that white Christians from places like Orange County are moving to Idaho because they see it as a haven for conservative politics and what they call religious freedom. Corey and Bonnie Martinelli own a real estate company called Live Better in North Idaho. They left California for Coeur d'Alene in 2009. Corey Martinelli, as a real estate agent and sort of mascot for North Idaho, says it's the best place to live in the United States. And he says in California, liberal politics were a menace to, quote, our spiritual rights, our family values, our economic stability, and our constitutional rights, especially the right to bear arms. So Californians have been undertaking a kind of right flight from the Golden State to Idaho and other places for a long time, but something happened about a decade ago that really accelerated Idaho's population growth. In 2011, James Wesley Rawls, a former US military intelligence officer born and raised in Northern California, dubbed the region, including Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Eastern Oregon, and Eastern Washington, the American Redoubt. In a now infamous blog post, Rawls identified this region of the country as the last fortress for traditional Americans to protect themselves against what he predicts will be an economic and political crisis. I believe that it is time for freedom-loving Christians to relocate to something analogous to Galt's Gulch, he writes. Rawls was following the lead of Chuck Baldwin, a pastor who was once Jerry Falwell's lieutenant in Florida, and who himself had called for a mass migration to the Redoubt region. America is headed for an almost certain cataclysm, Baldwin wrote. As Christians, we suspect that this cataclysm could include the judgment of God. As students of history, we believe that this cataclysm will most certainly include a fight between big government globalists and freedom-loving, independent-minded patriots. For Rawls and Baldwin, the goal is to create a separate society of American Christians who will defend their families and communities when the next civil war dawns. I'm a separatist, but on religious lines, not racial ones, Rawls writes in the blog post that now serves as the foundation for the Redoubt movement. I'm inviting people with the same outlook to move to the Redoubt states to affect the demographic solidification. We're already a majority here. I'd just like to see an even stronger majority. According to Rawls, closing ranks and setting up a de facto separate society is a way to prepare for, I quote, the second civil war here in America and caused by the gulf between the right and left, between the godly and the godless, between the libertarians and the statists, or between the individualists and the collectivists. For him, this means autonomy from the United States, a seceded state that is, quote, a stronghold of conservative traditional values while we see the rest of the United States sink into oblivion. It's tempting, and I know that many of us who study and write on these things resist this temptation all the time, but it is tempting to write someone like Rawls off as a fringe figure. But his popularity speaks, I think, to the resonance his worldview has with millions of Americans. His website gets 320,000 unique visitors per week, 320,000 unique visitors per week. He's a New York Times bestselling author with 5 novels and 2 nonfiction books published by major houses. He's not the only one helping to implement the Redoubt vision. His son runs Survival Realty, which specializes in off-the-grid properties in the Redoubt states. And there are other Redoubt realtors who specialize in helping, quote, refugees from California and other places find land. Todd Savage operates American Redoubt Realty. Each year, he helps nearly 3,000 Americans locate properties and make preparations to move to the Redoubt region. He met Rawls in 2003 and soon moved his own family from California to a homestead near Sandpoint, Idaho. We didn't quite fit in with the changing landscape in California, Savage told the Sandpoint reader. We were libertarian Christians who homeschooled, refused to poison our children through vaccinations, owned evil black rifles, and supported what would one day be known as the Blue Lives Matter movement. On his company website, Savage leaves no room for interpretation as to who is welcome in the Redoubt. Snowflakes, liberals, socialists, Marxists, communists, and other tyrants that hate our constitutional republic, the Bill of Rights, and want to defund law enforcement are not allowed to engage our services. Elected officials are also leading the Redoubt movement. Matt Shea was a state representative for a district in Eastern Washington, which is kind of on the outskirts of Spokane and Spokane borders, Idaho. And he served from 2008 to 2020. A 2019 report revealed how Shea took part in the effort led by ranchers such as Cliven and Ammon Bundy to forcibly occupy federal territories in an effort to reclaim them from the government. The most worrying aspect of the report was the revelation of Shea's desire for an alternative Christian government that lines up nearly identically to Rawls' vision for the American Redoubt. According to former Sheriff Ozzie Nezovich, who has known Shea for decades, it's clear that he does not want to, quote, preserve America, but instead he and others want to start their own country. This ideal came into clearer focus when Shea's manifesto on biblical warfare was leaked in 2018. In the 4-page document, Shea outlines his theory of just war. First, he lays out his vision for government. I quote, "Tyranny is never a divinely appointed means of government. A tyrant is someone who rules without God. Tyranny is not a lawful form of government. Godless civil rulers are no more than bands of robbers. When the rule of law dies as sin prevails throughout the land, tyranny is not far behind." After casting this vision, he sets the terms for negotiating with anyone who resists. Quote, "Make an offer of peace before declaring war. Not a negotiation or compromise of righteousness. Must surrender on terms of justice and righteousness." And that means 1, stopping all abortions. 2, no same-sex marriage. 3, no idolatry or occultism. And 4, no communism. 5, must obey biblical law. If they yield, they must pay their share of work or taxes. If they do not yield, kill all males. Shea's political career ended when these documents came to light. Somehow he'd become too extreme for one of the most radically conservative parts of the country. But he found a safe career landing spot, the church. Shea's now pastor of On Fire Ministries and Kingdom Christian Academy, where he regularly preaches the gospel of the American Redoubt. In early 2021, days before the election, he went to U.S. Representative Jim Risch's office in Coeur d'Alene and led the charge. "We're fighting and we're going to continue to fight. We're heading into a war," Shea yelled. "This was not an election. This was an attack on our country. That's what this was." He then made his feelings about democracy loud and clear. "We do not live in a democracy. Democracies are what have led us to this point, where people think they can rob us, loot us, close our businesses down, eviscerate our elections, try to destroy our institutions and our livelihoods and our farms. I don't want to live in a democracy. I love the rule of law." In terms of the networks that spread across the Redoubt movement, it's clear that the organizing coalition building spreads to anti-government militias. I've just mentioned the Bundys, who are quite a force in this part of the country. It's also worth noting that this summer, when Patriot Front attempted to attack a Pride event, they chose Coeur d'Alene. I interviewed several people who were at the event, and they described how they were minutes, if not seconds, from what could have been one of the worst attacks on a Pride event in American history, and were saved only by a tip from someone who saw the Patriot Front members get into their vehicles at a hotel. Several of the people who were arrested have direct connections to Matt Shea's church. So in closing, I'll say, and there's a lot more to say about this, that in the mid-20th century, the Sun Belt migration transformed American politics, religion, and culture. Where I grew up is the part of the country that gave us the popularity of Barry Goldwater, if not Goldwater himself. It raised Nixon in my hometown, birthed the political career of Ronald Reagan, and so on and so on and so on. Not to mention, as Jerome mentioned earlier, the John Birch Society had its epicenter right in Orange County. When I go home, I find Orange County to be more purple than it's been in my lifetime. There was a blue wave of sorts in terms of congressional elections a couple years ago. When I go out in the town in which I grew up, alongside the pizza restaurants and pasta places, there's taquerias and pho counters and sushi bars. The old bowling alley is now a Japanese market, which for a Japanese American boy who grew up there is a pretty nice addition. But those changes aren't happening because of changed hearts and minds. They're changing because of a white exodus, a white Christian exodus. And every time I turn on to social media, I see, not every time, but very, very often I find someone else who I've known from home who's announcing that their family has sold their home and moved to Idaho. So in my mind, the readout migration may have the potential for a similar effect as the Sun Belt migration. Only this time the goal is not to take control of a political party. The goal is to prepare for the collapse of the United States and the chance to rebuild it in their vision. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're now sort of moving to the panel conversation part, and are there questions that you'd like to ask of one another, or responses that you'd like to give to one another's presentations?
What patterns you see in terms of the media consumption of these two areas?
So the media consumption of where I grew up in Southern California, the kind of Bible Belt of Southern California, is really, I think, quite similar to, Anne, what you would describe in terms of driving through, your hometown. When I was growing up, a lot of the, you got in your friend's dad's truck on the way home from baseball practice, and there was Rush Limbaugh, right? The American Redoubt movement has really started to create, it's definitely listening to some of those, what they would call kind of established media sources and those established media networks, but they have their own, there's an American Redoubt radio that sort of begins each broadcast with, talking about how they're in the free zone, the last free zone of the United States. And they reach hundreds of thousands of people, every time they broadcast. And what they've done too, and I know that one of the things that really, I think, branches out into both of what you said is that they've inspired a vision, right? It's about imagining what could be. And so there are people now who have said, could we build a redoubt in Appalachia? Could we build a redoubt in the Ozarks? So it's not simply, hey, how many people have moved to Coeur d'Alene, or how many people have moved to Billings, Montana? It's who's watching, who's being influenced, what's the diffusion like, and all the ways that Anne and Katherine, your work is so good at sort of explaining and showing us. I see similar things happening in this movement as well. So
it's really interesting. I'd love to hear, Anne, what kind of shifts you see what kind of shifts you've seen in the media in your hometown?
Well, Stillwater, I see it in terms of the broadcast media, I see it fairly static. Mm-hmm. But I was just there last week, and I was talking to relatives from Nebraska, and they commented that in the entire western part of the state, the only broadcast network they can get is Fox. Mm-hmm. Right. So one thing that you have to combine with the media diet is the media vacuum and the various news deserts we have throughout the country. If you look at the map, there are just thousands, there's over 1,000 counties that have no newspaper at all. And you have the other media of radio, and then the dominance of Fox and Sinclair stations in these areas, plus this avalanche of online media masquerading as journalism. And the Sinclair products include Red State, PJ Media, Town Hall, et cetera, but they're also networked with Breitbart and some of the other platforms. And then you've got this proliferation of viral media and social media that are not easily visible to most of us, including Gab and Rumble and so on. So in terms of monitoring the media that people are actually consuming, it's becoming ever more difficult.
Katherine, you had a phrase there that I think is really quite astute. You said, what we're encountering are not just theories, but political pathologies. And I've seen that in your work, and I'm wondering if you could maybe elaborate on that. Why do you see Christian nationalism and broadly conceived as something akin to a pathology?
Well, it's a radically anti-democratic political movement. It rejects the foundations of our democracy itself. It is dividing our country as never before. I see the way that it operates as I see a lot of that division is intentional. and a country that's more divided, more angry, that is where a sector of the population has been made prone to believing certain kinds of disinformation and immune to accepting other forms of information, is going to make it much less governable. And frankly, that clears the way for an authoritarian reaction. That kind of chaos and that lack of ability to actually get things done, to tackle some of the real problems we have, clears the way for an authoritarian reaction. I actually see that increasingly as part of the plan. You know, in the time that I've been researching this movement, I hear a lot of, I always listen for patterns, and I listen for like word patterns, and I hear a lot about kings and kinging, and I think about Trump and how he was compared to a biblical king like King Cyrus, an imperfect ruler through whom God chose to enact his will. And a lot of folks say, well, he made a bargain with religious right, and certainly that's true, but can we imagine that any person who had won, would Ted Cruz have not chosen, the sort of pro-life judges, would any, it's more than that. I mean, he represents the lawlessness of the authoritarian. He's a law unto himself. And I think he appealed and continues to appeal to kind of the authoritarian impulses of his supporters. So I think, as Ralph Reed said, Trump taught our movement a lot. And, he kind of smashed, flung open the doors to this movement, gave them everything they wanted, but he also smashed a lot of norms and kind of licensed public hate and public contempt toward those who don't belong, or considered insufficiently American by representatives of this movement. And, we all think that America's special, it can't happen here. A lot of people refer to this, magical pendulum that's going to swing back somehow in the other direction. I'm not sure that's so true. And that's why I think of it as a political pathology. I do think that authoritarianism is a real danger of our time.
Can I add? Yeah, I also think that they're very intent on just undermining and ultimately destroying the various institutions of our society. And it's not a coincidence that the Leadership Institute and the Family Research Council have both been running national trainings for disrupting school boards. So you have this on a hyper local level, along with the precinct chairman on the political parties. And why is this so important? Well, it sows deep distrust of our institutions among communities. It sows division. It also provides a political pipeline for extremists. So you run for school board on this violent so-called critical race theory platform, and then it's a conduit to your local party leadership, which they're encouraging, and then you just kind of feed them up the political chain. So it's really an attempt to take over our system from the bottom up at the same time as the top down. And it's deeply, deeply corrosive of our democracy. It's also very damaging for our public institutions when you have teachers in Oklahoma being called Marxists, which they are not. And teachers who are there was a teacher who attempted to allow her students to read banned books through a barcode from the Brooklyn Public Library. She was not only fired, but the extremist Governor Stitt of Oklahoma wanted to revoke her teaching license. So you get very vocal political extremists in office who then undermine the institutions they're supposed to represent.
That effort to undermine public education is a longstanding goal of this movement. I think Jerry Falwell made the agenda plain in 1979. He said, I hope to see the day when there are no more public schools. Churches will have taken them over. Christians will be running them. Betsy DeVos, a former Secretary of Education, has been involved in education activism for several decades. She was very involved in trying to siphon public money from public schools and divert it to faith schools through voucher programs. Her initiatives, she devoted enormous amounts of money to this project. She's expressed hostility to public education in various ways. She and her husband were caught on tape calling their education activism a means of advancing God's kingdom, and said it would lead to greater kingdom gain. And then her husband at one point was speaking to a number of folks and said, but we have to be very quiet. We shouldn't speak about these projects. I'm sort of paraphrasing here. We shouldn't be too open about discussing what we're doing. But this has been there's been sort of longstanding hostility to public schools because of their pluralism, because they are open to families of all type. And yet many leaders of the movement have cast them as sort of government schools, as sort of command control, top down. They sort of, Betsy DeVos's family sent at least $5.5 million to G. James Kennedy, a very political pastor who came up with a pamphlet, came up with a speech and a pamphlet called A Godly Education, where he denounced the sort of atheism, secularism of these public schools. And we're seeing this new kind of war on public education taking new forms today with this sort of, race baiting, fake CRT stuff. I have a friend who's a second grade math teacher, and he said now he's approached in his community by parents who say, are you teaching critical race theory to your kids? And he's like, I'm teaching second grade math. Let me show you my textbooks. But it's a way of tapping into racial anxieties and racism of these families, and also of fostering distrust in public education altogether. And as Anne said, also getting folks involved in local politics as a means of perhaps, preparing them to take the next step and get involved in politics on another level. So, we are seeing a lot of misinformation promoted around public schools and have for a very long time. But at root is a kind of war on public schools, public education altogether.
Yes, that was the Department of Homeland Security. That was January 2008.
Eric McDaniel, University of Texas. One of the things that keeps coming to mind when looking at these very authoritarian regimes, or the attempts to build these authoritarian regimes, is what degree is there infighting? Because I'm assuming they're all seeking power, and right now they are saying, okay, this is the best engine for me to get power. But is there evidence that they're just trying to undercut each other so they can be on top? And all right, and how are they preventing that from taking shape?
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you mind repeating the question? I'm so sorry.
So the question was mainly, what are they doing? We know with a lot of nationalist movements, there's a big fight. There's usually internal fights over power. And because of this, you'll see a lot of movements fall apart because of the internal struggles and things like that. To what degree are there internal struggles, and how have they been able to stop the internal struggles?
Yeah, my analysis, for what it's worth, is that in terms of the Republican Party, the division of Christian nationalists are necessary but not sufficient for them to take control of the country. And I would have answered your question differently last week, but the Washington Post article about Kevin McCarthy's investing major funding from the Republican Party against Trump-endorsed candidates indicates that there is this split that's going on, where some of the candidates are so extreme and do not play well with traditional Republicans. And so there's a split between this incredible energy of the MAGA base combined with the traditional Republicans who say this goes too far. And the polling indicates that if you use words like violent extremism and, you know, depict January 6th in that light, that resonates a great deal with the public. So my sense is that McConnell and McCarthy are trying to distance themselves enough to save some kind of reputation, but not enough to lose the base. Now, remember, in terms of the Council for National Policy, they had favored Ted Cruz going into 2016. And Trump appeared and they decided to embrace him, but I don't regard that as a lasting marriage. So the thing to know about them is that they're always playing three strategies at once on three different levels. And whatever divisions you see in Congress and the presidency will be coinciding with strategies in the courts and in the state legislatures. So it's a very complex map, and it's less than 40 days till the election.
Anthony Butler, University of Pennsylvania. Thank you all for your comments, but I want to direct this one to Bradley. When you were talking, all I could think of was the B-52 songs, Your Own Private Idaho. So you need to use that. Thank me later. But I do have a question about this, because I've been thinking about this in terms of preppers and all of these other people. Do you find them to have some kind of like really high kind of theological thing about end times, or are they just like there, or what? Because I'm trying to figure out where all these people sort of sit on a timeline in terms of, I'll talk about this in the next panel about why I think authoritarianism is changing, and part of that has to do with the collapse of certain kinds of theological beliefs, right? So I'm just wondering how they see this world structured, and how much do they rely on scripture or extra biblical scripture to put themselves in a certain kind of space.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anthea, for that question. What I was not able to talk about in the 10 minutes that I spoke was the theological underpinnings of the Redoubt movement are really Reconstructionist. And so the eschatology is post-millennial for the most part. Now, that's not uniform, and we could go find theological differences and apocalyptic visions that vary. But on the whole, you find a post-millennial vision of the world. So the goal is wait it out. Wait till this United States that we know collapses, and then we're going to rebuild it in our vision. And then that's going to lead to that post-millennial reign is going to be one that the preppers, the hoarders, the survivalists, the militias were the ones that will take over when that happens. So, one of the things I hope that we get into as the conference goes on is the changing apocalyptic visions of Christian nationalists in this country, from a predominantly premillennial to what seems to be now, and I'm open to talk about this, of course, in greater complexity, but what seems to be now a wave of post-millennial apocalypticism that really fits better with the goal of creating your own country instead of just waiting for Jesus to come get you. So
I just wonder whether you hear any language around accelerationism.
Very much so. And I think this links up, and to your question earlier about Bannon, right? Where someone like Bannon and his vision really appeals to like the Redoubt movement and anyone who's in that ethos, because the acceleration is not going to accelerate like we might have thought in a premillennial vision of Jesus coming sooner. It's gonna accelerate. We get to rule the world sooner. So that sounds pretty good.
Much new apostolic reformation activity in that area, or even like the style and language of the new apostolic reformation, if not the actual networks?
I think there's some of that. I think, for those of you, and I'm sure that there's those of you here and those online who have a background here, the Redoubt movement really has antecedents in the white identity movement of Richard Butler in Idaho, and also Doug Wilson in Moscow has obviously been there for decades. And so the Reconstructionism is very heavy. There is an influence from Rushdoony. I would not say that this is NAR native territory per se, but that doesn't mean that influence hasn't reached the movement either.
The language of spiritual warfare, references to Seven Mountains.
So there's definitely language of spiritual warfare for sure, but I'm not sure that the language of apostles and prophets and them having kind of individual authority in the ways that we might think Cindy Jacobs and Dutch Sheets and Cheon talk about it, is the kind of native parlance of that movement per se.
Hi, Brian Haggard, student from Cornell University. I have two questions. You can kind of pick whichever one you want. The first is, a lot of scholars kind of connect the rise of like business elite conservatism with the Christian right, and basically argue that they're using the Christian right as a mechanism to get votes, to then pass very conservative economic policy. Do you think that's valid based on your analysis, or kind of do you think the business people are now worrying that they're kind of running away? Oh, you're talking about rebuilding America. We just wanted lower taxes. The second question pertains to kind of this like apocalyptic survivalist ideology. Do you see any connections within the movements to historical American examples? For example, like the American South for the very early history mimicked what they're now dreaming of, where it is a bunch of white guys with guns kind of controlling their own communities surrounded by their churches. And it's only been a modern phenomena that the federal and even state governments have kind of intervened and actually produced real government. Thank you.
I think I can start with the first one, and maybe you guys can pick up on it as well. I think there are sectors of the business community that absolutely, yes, thought, well, how do we get people to vote for our economic interests? You know, they'll vote on the culture wars and that's fine, and are now sort of panicked, like, yes, all we wanted was lower taxes, lower corporate taxes, and now look what's happened, and are kind of rethinking. But I do think that there is a sector of, you know, look, I mean, any sector within society is going to be incredibly diverse. So there are some people, like, two things can be true at the same time. There are many people who see this within their economic interests, and they also think that this is, you know, a better way to organize society.
Yeah, I think it's complicated because the business sector and elite business sector do not speak with one voice. And even in the microcosm of Oklahoma, you've got Harold Hamm, who is solidly conservative and aligned with this movement. But then you've got George Kaiser in Tulsa, who is the opposite, and they're both very influential. You know, I would say that more of the fossil fuel industry trends towards this grouping. You also have a regional division where you've got the Midwest and the Southwest and the American petrostates aligned with this, and much less so in terms of the New York and the West Coast financial interests.
I just want to add, I do think that there's a large sector of the business community that is completely opposed to the agenda altogether and is, you know, deeply unhappy about it. So as you said, it's a very diverse.
That second question. So one of my arguments about why the redoubt is so effective in Idaho, Wyoming, Eastern Washington, Montana, Eastern Oregon is because, so you mentioned the South, right? You say, well, how come we don't have the redoubt in Texas? I mean, we think Texas is a leader. Texas is the forefront of casting the conservative vision for the country, and the kind of shadow opposite of California. But if you're doing state level politics in Texas, you're always going to run into Houston, the fourth largest city in the country. A lot of Black people in Houston. There's a lot of Asian people in Houston. It's a big place, and you're just not going to be able to kind of go unchecked. You're going to run into Austin, right? If you do this in Pennsylvania, you're going to run into Philly and Pittsburgh. If you do this even in Wisconsin, you run into Milwaukee, which is a segregated city, but right, there are a lot of people who are not white in that city. You do this in Georgia, you run into Atlanta. If you do this in Idaho, you run into Boise. It's a lot easier. So it's way easier to do this on a state level political kind of operation in Montana and Wyoming and Idaho when you run into Boise, rather than running into Philly, rather than running into Houston, rather than running Atlanta. So to me, that's why the redoubt, along with its topography, is actually really strategic.
Hi, Jerome Kapolsky, Georgetown, and this was really great and informative. I want to pick up on what you were speaking about with the public schools, and particularly the attack upon the public schools, which probably goes back to at least the 1960s.
It goes back to the formation of public schools.
Yeah, and it goes well in a way, and I guess this is the question, which
South
is
in particular.
Right. The schools are important for religious for general education, for religious education, also for civic or nationalist education. A lot of the fights about the public schools and what should be taught and who should be in them were about those things. And so the question is, insofar as you try to take out the public schools and fill in the public schools with homeschooling or religious schools, how does that complicate the larger nationalist project, right? If you've taken out a shared institution of education and you've sort of left it to the discretion of communities or families, has that been sort of thought about or theorized by people in these movements, or it does in fact the place of the inculcation of the national project kind of fall off?
Well, no, it's actually, there's another sector of that, which is charters. And look, I think there are a lot of well-run charters run by people who really want to improve education and are committed to transparency and educational excellence. But one thing that the movement has done is want to open the door for, want to promote the public funding of charter schools, many of whom, by the way, are run by people with right-wing or religious ideological agendas. When I was writing my last book, which came out in 2012, it was an examination of the religious right in public education. I looked at the top 20, actually, no, it was in this book. It was a new chapter in my current book. I called a representative of the largest sort of pro-charter organization in the country. And I looked at the top 20 charter networks, and 8 of the top 20 were run by people with, distinct right-wing or religious ideological agendas. One of them, for instance, had written a book that was endorsed by R.J. Rushdoony. Another one is a buddy of, his name is Huizenga. He's J.C. Huizenga. He's a buddy of Betsy DeVos. And, the idea of, their ideas like siphon money from the public schools, often like some of them introduce sort of religious concepts directly into the public schools, but that's, many of them don't. And that is in any way, the most egregious means of doing this. A lot of them almost like smuggle right-wing ideas through patriotism or education about what it means to be a good American, or kind of Christian nationalist teaching history that, whose talking points will come directly from the texts of somebody like David Barton, who's one of the movement's sort of key myth makers of our allegedly conservative Christian founding and things like that. They also want, public money to go for religious schools. And they've won several very key Supreme Court decisions to increase the flow of public money for religious schools. Carson versus Macon, there was a case in Montana that the right also sort of won. And many of these religious schools teach bigotry toward other faiths, discriminate against women, LGBT students and teachers, even say that if you're working as a custodian in the school, you have to adhere to certain sort of lifestyle or belief system. So, I think, it's a large country. Not every school is right for every kid, and, choice can play a role, but turning public education into a consumer experience for parents who choose to funnel public taxpayer money to schools that teach bigotry toward other faiths and discriminate is not a way to improve education, really. It's more of a way of advancing what Betsy DeVos described with her husband, advancing a sort of kingdom aims according to their version of what those kingdom aims might be.
It's also a bigger enterprise. They're really seeking to create an alternate architecture of knowledge. So, for example, Hillsdale College and Larry Arnn are core partners at the Council for National Policy. They have developed a curriculum which the governor of Tennessee proposed bringing into Tennessee public schools. and the curriculum followed the outlines of the manifesto you suggested. So it's also co-opting public education and undermining pre-existing forces within public education. Betsy DeVos has waged merciless war on teachers' unions. And in Oklahoma, where teachers are chronically underpaid and education is chronically underfunded, a group of public school teachers were going to run for the state legislature to advocate for greater funding for their schools. Betsy DeVos personally invested several $100,000 to defeat these teachers running for the legislature. So it also takes, the curriculum has its advocates, and not just David Barton, who is rewriting American history. You probably didn't know, for example, that Columbus was really kind to the Taino Indians and to the African Americans that he brought to the New World. It's like a whole new way of looking at American history. And you have Victor Davis Hanson, who teaches for Hillsdale Online, which has a massive online audience, right? It publishes Imprimis magazine, which claims to have 6 million subscribers. So this information and this revision of really established thinking and research and evolving research on our national life, including medicine and treatment of COVID, is a very, very large and well-funded enterprise.
Hi, Bart Bonikowski, NYU. Thank you for these fascinating presentations. I have a question for Brad. I think you're quite right to suggest that we should know better than to write off movements like the Read Out movement. And I agree. I would like to speak a little more about sort of what you see as the concrete political consequences potentially of this movement. Is the danger that they may amplify and legitimate the messages that we've been hearing about? Is it that this may become sort of a place for the training of the ground troops of the next insurrection or so forth? What are some of the other consequences? These folks are waiting for the collapse of the United States and the creation of a new state. That's unlikely to happen anytime soon, although we probably will become authoritarian in a couple of years. But right, that it may be a while before that vision comes to fruition. So I guess I'm wondering what they're thinking in terms of strategy. And just one last thing, this just not to be a little flippant about it. Sending all the white Christian nationalists to one state or a couple of states as a political strategy is interesting in the sense that that will make Orange County more democratic. And I can imagine a few other places becoming more democratic as a result. So maybe not so bad. Although on the other hand, of course, we know about mutually reinforcing cleavages being bad and sectionalism and all that. But wouldn't a wiser strategy for them to be send these folks to migrate to swing states, right, to gain more political power in the long run? So how do we think about sort of segregation of white Christian nationalists in certain geographic areas versus more a broader distribution of them politically?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I think on a grand level, there's a lot of talk about secession, a lot. And so there's a lot of talk about we should, Eastern Oregon should become part of Idaho. Spokane is not really Washington. We want nothing to do with Seattle. So let's get those parts of those states officially into Idaho. And then let's get Montana and Wyoming and we'll all secede. Now, economically, it's a really bad choice. It would not go well. But I don't know if that's realistic. On the ground, though, like what you're asking about on the ground. So if we take Kootenai County, which used to be up to 25 years ago, kind of like a purple place, as Ann might have talked about Oklahoma decades ago, we're seeing some of the most radical right-wing politics in the country. And I know that for many in this room, we're kind of numb to that. But I mean, we're seeing the point of not just, hey, let's take some of the books out of the library that we want to ban. We're seeing, why do we have a library? Like, I just looked at the city's budget and we gave $28,000 to a library. No. So you elect me, we're not doing that. So like on the ground, what we're seeing is, why do we have libraries? And soon it's, why do we have public schools again? Like, so I think that those secession is one thing. Why do we have a library? Why do we have a police force? We got this militia over here. We got this, Christian schools over here. We don't need those. And I know that sounds fantastical, but in these kinds of enclaves that are quite isolated, you can kind of get there politically. I think one of the other real kind of things and that is happening on the ground is, we're talking about networking with other aspects of what we might talk about as either Christian nationalist movements or white nationalist movements. And so I brought up Patriot Front. Patriot Front chooses Coeur d'Alene to attack that Pride event. It's not an accident because, right, they're networked with the churches. They know they have the politician support and they can kind of find a kind of friendly audience when it comes to judges and other politicians in power in those parts of the country. So Patriot Front didn't choose to attack Pride in San Francisco or in Austin, right? It chose Coeur d'Alene. And so I think it's becoming that kind of testing ground for this kind of movement. So Patriot Front, a white nationalist, openly racist kind of organization, links up with the survivalist, the prepper, the Christian homeschooler. And all of a sudden on the ground, we see those kinds of consequences. As it comes to strategy in terms of isolation, I'm not sure, Rawls and many of those who subscribe to this ideology really see isolation as the way to wait out the cataclysm. So if you think the thing's going to collapse, who cares about winning an election? Like, some of these folks will say, I didn't vote for Trump because I don't care. They're still in that mode of, I didn't vote for Trump in 2016. I didn't vote for him in 2020, because I'm pretty sure by 2030, the rest of the United States will be dealing with nuclear fallout. We'll all be in our bunkers. And when we come out, we'll be ready to take things over. So who cares about moving to Pennsylvania, Arizona, Wisconsin, Virginia, so on and so forth.
I'm Sam Goldman from George Washington University. So I have to report that I have sat in many rooms, although not usually so nice as this one, and heard almost identical presentations with a few key substitutions. So for Christian nationalism, put cultural Marxism or CRT or gender ideology. For Koch or DeVos, put the Rockefeller Foundation or the Pritzker family. For Hillsdale, put Yale. For David Parton, put Ibram Kendi or Robin DiAngelo. And reflecting on that experience, I'm tempted to ask how much of what you're describing here is really particular to Christian nationalism or to the political right, and how much is an expression of a kind of post-materialist, elite-driven donor politics that has become increasingly definitive of American life.
Why is it either or? It can be both and I agree that elite donor-driven politics, I mean, in my estimation, plays a massive, if not definitive role in this. I also want to run a correction. When I mentioned the manifesto, I meant Jerome's citation of the manifesto. Sorry about that. But yeah, I mean, if you take out the money, I don't know that the people that you see in the rallies are capable of creating a movement of this kind. And if you take out the media and the media systems, which are also heavily funded, they are very important in terms of organizing. So, the other thing that you ask is cui bono, who benefits? And certainly the people at the rallies are basically voting to dismantle their own children's education and to serve their communities polluted water. And we see that the beneficiaries in the gated communities who don't pay as many taxes. So that's how I see it.
I just said quickly that form and function aren't the same always, and I think we're going to hear some later presentations about asymmetric polarization and some data on that. And so I guess I would say that we can structure talks the same, that report on what we take to be radical extremists, fill in the blank in terms of the threats to our, and we can fill in the blank again, to our democracy, to quote our way of life, to quote our whatever. But just because you have people who are coming from a certain political background and worried about certain things, or simply people who study a certain phenomenon and are trying to relay that publicly, doesn't mean that the content of those concerns, the ideologies, the goals, the missions are the same. And I think to posit that idea, to posit just because the structures are the same, that the goals are the same, is dangerous. So.
My name is Sarah Riccardi Swartz, Northeastern University, and this is a comment for Brad and then a question more broadly for the panel. Thank you so much for this great discussion. Brad, you know that I work on communities very similar to the one that you're covering, and I'm thinking about the role of education in these communities because I see the same sort of undermining of public education, but I see it coming not only through homeschooling, but this idea of classical education. And classical education has become this idea that's linked to being ungovernable within America. If you are in the stream of classic education, you are outside of the stream of indoctrination. And so I'm wondering what you see in those communities. My other question, and this is broadly, but also sort of for Brad as well, is about branding and marketing. I was following a Eastern Orthodox event in Montana recently called Montanica, which drew in not only Eastern Orthodox, but trad Catholics and Christian conservatives of every stripe. And then there was also a recent event in West Virginia called Trad Forum 2. And I've seen other events like this popping up. I'm wondering how your group is branding or marketing themselves to others that are like them, but perhaps don't run in the same currents or streams, especially online.
So even before you said it, the classical education was what I was going to say, is that, so if you look at one of the real originators of what's going on in Idaho, it's Doug Wilson. And so if you study Doug Wilson in Moscow, you know, there's a school there, but that school has now spawned hundreds of schools across the country that brand in the classical education mode that you're describing. And so this is where I really think the trad Catholics and some of the Orthodox communities that you study, Sarah, really links up with the Redoubt and what's happening in Idaho. And there's some real resonance. And you can sell that classical education as highbrow, as not a small Christian school that meets in one room. And, you know, classical education sounds like it harkens back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And we're really doing something quite elevated. And so that is having a ton of success. I can tell you, just going back to Orange County, I saw a post on social media the other day from someone I graduated high school with that said, "I'm so glad I put my kid in the classical education school down the road. It's changed their life. It's changed our life. And it's the best decision I've ever made as a parent." And that links up with what I think everything Anne and Katherine have talked about when it comes to the war on public education. So, yeah.
So I've got a sort of a broader question for all three of you. There've been some great questions coming in online, but I think actually you've addressed an awful lot of them. So I'm going to ask a broader question, which is about organizational change. In particular, I guess what I'm wondering is whether there has been a shift from more centralized to more decentralized forms of organization. I mean, one could argue that this has happened within American religious life. Example which came up earlier was the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation, which is not, for those who don't know about it, it's a radical brand of Pentecostalism, which is not really centered in brick and mortar churches, not really centered around settled clergy, but it's kind of more pop-up events that are kind of a mix of, I don't know, music concert, political rally, religious revival, you know, outdoor flea market. I mean, kind of all of the above. And so I don't know, maybe, you know, this has always been the case, but I'm just curious if you guys see, you know, shifts in the kind of organizational structure of the Christian right more broadly, or the white Christian nationalists current within it more specifically.
Well, thanks for the question. I was thinking about, as you're talking about the New Apostolic Reformation, I thought about somebody like Doug Mastriano, in Pennsylvania who has identified, he's been associated with the Mennonite Church, and yet he has representatives of the New Apostolic Reformation at a lot of his campaign rallies. And whether or not he is NAR himself, or somebody like Mike Flynn, for instance, who has identified as a Catholic, they're adopting the language of NAR, talking about spiritual warfare and demons, and we're in this apocalyptic struggle between absolute good and absolute evil. And so there is a lot of sort of collaboration in those ways. Flynn himself may not be NAR, but he is certainly NAR adjacent. He works with Lance Wallnau, the Reawaken America tours that he has been at the center of, involve, folks from many different movements and denominations. I wouldn't think of, I think of the NAR not in the way of a denomination in the way that, say, the United Methodist Church are perhaps, or although they do have a structure and infrastructure, training, et cetera. But there's almost like a language or a style that draws together a lot of these neo-Pentecostal or charismatic movements. There are many different ones, and there are folks who kind of, some are more structured than others. But I am saying that kind of, that language and style permeating in different areas. And I'm starting to see people who would not have included that type of, very sort of like hot language, like very aggressive demonization of one's political enemies, all of a sudden be included in these much more, I would say, mainstream Christian right initiatives. So like at the last two Road to Majority conferences, which I attended, one in Florida, the other in Tennessee. The first in 2021, there was a Seven Mountains breakout session. In 2022, there were two Seven Mountains breakout sessions. There's an organization called the Ziklag Group, which has been tied in with United in Purpose, which had a sort of very sophisticated data component to it. They had a gathering in Texas where Mike Flynn spoke, former Vice President Mike Pence spoke, also Ben Carson. So you see these, and then there was a Seven Mountains workshop at that gathering as well. So you're starting to see collaboration among these different factors. There is a lot of sort of, it is a very diverse in its ways ecosystem, but folks are collaborating on these sort of common, in this common political project.
Can you explain what Seven Mountains is?
Oh, sorry. Seven Mountains is an ideology according to which certain types of Christians are called to take control of the seven molders or mountains of culture, which include, let's see, government, media, education, family, religion, business, and apparently the ideology supposedly got its start when Lauren Cunningham of Youth with a Mission and Bill Bright with Campus Crusade for Christ, which is now Cru, allegedly heard messages from God telling them to, take control of these seven mountains or molders of culture. The ideology got a big start, got a big push from Lance Wallnau, who has worked with Mike Flynn, and was really promoted by a fellow named C. Peter Wagner, who is a sort of church planting guru. Even people like Tim Keller of the Gospel Coalition, which is considered kind of mainstream evangelicalism. He published a book, I believe it was 2011. He cited C. Peter Wagner 3 times in the first 20 pages, including in the introduction of the book, the only person he sort of cited with that frequency up front in his book. So C. Peter Wagner is like a very influential kind of mission, church planting strategist. And Wagner was a great proponent of this ideology. He published a book called Dominion, How Kingdom Action Can Transform the World. I think that's the subtitle. He said that, this is taking dominion back from Satan, meaning that any of the, peaks of our culture, any sector of our culture, any major culture that is not dominated by Christians of a certain type are under the control of Satan. This is a radically anti-democratic, anti-pluralistic ideology, and we are seeing it mainstreamed within what many people, refer to as the Christian right. We're seeing it mainstreamed within the Christian right.
Lance Wallnau has made himself a very wealthy man promoting this ideology. And for a good time, you should look at his book, God's Chaos Candidate, which has a cover of the shredding of the American flag. And of course, it refers to Donald Trump. I also wonder how much of this is a matter of vote harvesting. A lot of the movement originally, if you go back to 1980, was rooted in the Southern Baptist Convention of Texas and Oklahoma. They show up again and again in terms of the formation of the Council for National Policy, Family Research Council, and other organizations. And it's my belief that once Ralph Reed helped to organize these networks of pastors, which were heavily Southern Baptist, if not exclusively, over a few decades, they might have tapped out the available votes in these communities. They leaned on them very hard. They used church directories to compare to voter rolls and just mobilize all the Republicans and either persuade or discourage the Democrats in these congregations in these critical districts. So if they tapped out the vote, what comes next? One thing I've noticed in attending various charismatic and Pentecostal churches is that unlike the Southern Democrats, they're the most diverse rooms full of lots of people that I've seen in this country. So for example, Times Square Church in New York City, Life Church in Oklahoma, you will have a very large percentage of African Americans as well as white congregants, as well as recent immigrants. And these are very rich, often unengaged voter populations for them to go after. So as Katherine pointed out, if you win over the pastor of one of these unaffiliated mega churches, you have the potential to bring these new voters into the fold. And again, they have voter registration in the parking lot. They have cell phone apps that drive them to the polls with the expectation of how they're going to vote. So it's a very powerful mechanism.
If I can just note two things on just building off of what both of you said. One would be that, and if I take what you really show us in Shadow Network and that Richard Viguerie and the kind of advent of direct mailing. And we really start to see that those outside of a church have perhaps more sway on how people vote in that church than the pastor. And that if we start to see the pastor as themselves kind of at the whim of more powerful political forces, you not only have to get the pastor on board, but sometimes the pastor has to get on board what the congregation is already learning and hearing from their radio stations, from the things that in those decades, the 70s and 80s, were being mailed to them. And so then you fast forward, right? And when you get in the car in 1992, you hear James Dobson every half hour, right? And so James Dobson's not a pastor, but he's probably the most influential minister, right, for a lot of people. And so if you're a pastor and you're not on board with James Dobson, you might lose your people, right? And so now in a world of podcasts, YouTube channels, Instagram accounts, those pastors have to make decisions all the time of like, am I on board? My people already know some stuff when they get here. And so do I want to keep my job and my people? And if I do, I've got to listen to not only them, but all the sort of powers that be swirling around us who are targeting us, right? And your work shows us, and the documentary that you were part of that everyone should watch, People You May Know. Did I get that right? The People You May Know really shows us this in great detail. And so I just want to not envision the pastor as the kind of like final decision maker there. That's one. And then two, I think we should see this as a continuation rather than a disruption. That if the advent of the CNP and the moral majority was a situation in which political midwives and mercenaries had overwhelming influence on what became the religious right, that the podcast, Instagram, media scape that we now live in is in some ways a disruption of that, but it's in many ways a continuation, right? It's in many ways, the pastor hasn't had sole authority here for a long, long time. And they're at the whim of the people they look at every Sunday and at all those swirling voices and spirits that are outside telling those people who to vote for, how they should feel. And I think we should zero in on that. People come to church have already being told how they should feel. You should be angry about this, resentful about that, disappointed about this, hopeful about that, and really, really, really ragingly violent mad about this.
Are you seeing the involvement of Q in this picture?
Sure. I mean, you know, but again, so like when I think of Q, I don't think of Advent. I think of baby of. I mean, I think of John Birch, you know, I think of Satanic Panic that was mentioned earlier by Jerome. I think of conspiracy theory as a great tool by, you know, the elites that we're discussing in many ways for decades. So
I'm just gonna sort of jump in and make a couple of quick points and then push the conversation in a slightly different but related direction. So actually I want to link up Samuel's point about the influence of big money and the point that you guys have been making about the sort of decentralization and the sort of devolution of these sort of denominational and ecclesiastical structures and hierarchies, because I think those points are connected, right? That if you're not a member of the Southern Baptist Convention anymore, if you're just an independent pastor, who are actually your peers? Who are actually the people who influence you? Well, you know, it's you know, outside, it's not even just sort of powerful people within your congregation anymore. It's these powerful and rich people outside of your congregation, and sort of conspiracy theories then, you know, become a way of creating a kind of a meta theology that links together, you know, a bunch of different folks. I'll turn it over to Jason, who's got a question.
I mean, this is actually following on a little and in sympathy with Sam's point. I mean, I take it Sam is saying this is representing, like, there are these white Christian nationalists who are under the grips of these spells, and then there are these elite institutions where we're free of them and think of ourselves as wise. But the very things, properties we're talking about, classical education, our directed studies program at Yale is like the crown jewel of Yale. All students are, I mean, it took us years to get Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk on the syllabus. And we only got it on the syllabus because, you know, it fits in with it's pro-classical education, you know. So, you know, my department's never had a Black faculty member. I mean, it's only 2022, and, you know, you know, it's never had a Black faculty member, yet there are multiple departments claiming we're attacked by the woke. You know, there are many departments that have, we never had a tenured Black faculty member. Our last Black faculty member was Anthony Appiah in 1986 when I was in 11th grade. So, you know, our institution of Yale has produced many of the leaders of the movements we're discussing today. You know, J.D. Vance, you know, not just J.D. Vance. I was at a secret society meeting on Wednesday where William F. Buckley Jr. William F. Buckley was being praised to high heavens, and 40 undergrads and the speaker clapped, had a round of applause for him as the quintessential Yale grad. So this idea that there's this separation between the elite and the idea that the white Christian nationalism is somehow not tied to this institution seems incorrect to me. Not that it was super explicitly.
Yeah, of course, the list is longer. You forgot Brett Kavanaugh and Josh Hawley, for example, just to mention a few others. So the question another question I want to throw towards you guys. This came in from outside, but I think fits into this question about changing organizational structure, decentralization. What this means is about the Constitutional Sheriffs and Police Officers Association. And also, of course, its connection to militia groups, and I'm sure we'll follow up on when final panel with us in the military interest. But and it might be helpful if somebody would just briefly explain, you know, what the CSPOA is, because that may not be something everybody knows about.
Okay. Yeah, I have been trying to follow this organization for a while. And, when we talk about this network, it's not a seamless single entity. There are overlapping networks. And one thing that recent research that's not fully developed yet shows is that you've got various churches, especially Pentecostal churches, which are recruiting centers for militias. You have militias that have considerable membership in both police departments and among county sheriffs. The county sheriffs have been very actively recruited because they can play a role in overseeing election matters. So this is all going on, and there are reports that surface, but I haven't seen anyone pull together kind of an organic overview for it. But I do believe it's very concerning.
Fun fact, the Claremont Institute has instituted a constitutional sheriff's workshop where they bring in people every year.
Hey, thank you for the interesting session. So another maybe more general question, but we are talking here about elections, about a white Christian nationalist. Do you think they can get tired of the system, of the, wants to change the system from within, and then we can expect seeing them going more and more through radicalization, more and more through accelerationism? What do you think?
I think we are seeing increased radicalization, just the open embrace of conspiracism, election conspiracism, and other conspiracies, not just January 6th, but the defense of the people who, who perpetrated the attack on our Capitol. People like Dinesh D'Souza and Erickson have said things like, we won't defend our guys even when they're good guys, and have said, that was sort of expressed support, saying, we need to defend the, those folks, the January 6th people, and saying it very openly. And then, somebody like Ralph Reed sort of nodding and responding, I think Donald Trump taught our movement a lot. And, it's I think this is absolute radicalization, the idea that our elections should no longer be decided by people, but by electors, state electors that are put into place in order to select the right-wing candidates rather than any candidate that the voters are preferring. A kind of radical suppression of the vote, the idea that you can, that there are laws now that say it's illegal to bring a person who's been waiting in line to vote, for hours. You can't bring them a glass of water or a chair to sit in, which, of course, is going to affect people in some districts, but not in others. It's ridiculous. The diminishment of voting sites in Democratic-leaning districts and in districts where you have a disproportionate number of voters of color. These are radical, anti-democratic, authoritarian actions. The kind of, I would say, suppression of books, of education, the idea that you can't teach about America's history of race or slavery or segregation or redlining, racial redlining, that's a radical action. So I think that this is no longer about working within the system. I think it's like the movement is becoming more radical. Its language is becoming more radical. We're no longer hearing Democrats, for instance, referred to as often as people who, are human beings, but have a different political viewpoint. All of a sudden, we're starting to hear more language about Democrats being described as satanic or democratic organizations as demonic organizations. This is the kind of language you hear in some of the strategy gatherings and conferences. This is absolutely radical. That kind of demonization of one's political enemy can really be seen as a kind of language of genocide. I was watching Russian state TV through a translator, and I heard this one speaker, who's like sort of prominent newscaster, propagandist, say, you know, those Ukrainians are demonic, they're little devils, and you good Orthodox soldiers, you need to finish them off. And that sort of demonization of one's political enemies is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, one term that's surfacing is democrats. And I was at a Ted Cruz rally in Dallas where somebody told me with an absolutely straight face that Beto O'Rourke was the son of Satan. So this is very commonplace in various places. I think it's important to remember also that when Paul Weyrich and Morton Blackwell laid a lot of the groundwork for this movement, they said very specifically, you don't have to be right. So they don't they don't really care about being factually right or even morally right. They say you just have to win. And because they see the end result as justifying the means, you have this phenomenon where they'll state outrageous things to poorly informed voters who then believe it. And then you have the journalists and the academics trailing behind trying to do fact checking. And by the time they catch up with all the fact checking, they've moved on to another untruth. So I don't think we've figured out how to deal with this dynamic.
Final question. Mike, and we'll take 2 questions. We'll also from the audience.
Why the understandable urge of pointing out hypocrisy doesn't do anything. It won't persuade any of their followers because they do not care. It's about winning, and it has been about winning for a while. And I was wondering, because you just stated that we're basically always trying to catch up. Do any of you have any ideas or strategies that would have to be implemented be it by researchers or by journalists on how to more effectively cover this and not be constantly sort of running after them?
We'll just take them both at the same time.
Great. Hi. Well, Jesus loves winners, which I heard in one of these churches. So I'm Liza McAllister, and I teach right up the road at Wesleyan. And I've been working with the New Apostolic Reformation folks doing missions. So I've taken a spiritual warfare workshop and a SWAT boot camp and was at a Lance Wallnau conference, one of those big conferences. And what I wanted to just note is that there's a fluidity to the fixity of both theology and politics, so that I like your idea of meta theology or just a fluid and vague theology. So they never want to get too specific about pre or post millennialism because they don't want to send anyone away. And so both the theologies and the politics shift and flow according to the moment, I think. And so I'm wondering if you have ever found any sovereign citizens in especially the West, and whether they've harnessed that interesting political strategy and ideology. Thank you.
I can take Annika. Go for it. So in terms of the US media, I subscribe to Victor Pickard of the University of Pennsylvania's idea. He wrote a very interesting slender book called Democracy Without Journalism ? And he argues that the most successful model for serving communities through journalism has existed in Scandinavia, where the government has supplied tax dollars to support local professional journalism without government intervention. Because right now, the capitalist model has failed local journalism in the United States. And I would argue that you need a mixture which provides communities with information in print and radio and broadcast and online, and not just the high-end investigative journalism that you have of the ProPublica model, but also the meat and potatoes local journalism where people can find their kids' basketball score because they might absorb some news by osmosis.
On that line, and this is more interpersonal, but I just, people ask, because of the show I do, people ask me all the time, how am I supposed to talk to my family, my brother, my cousin, my aunt, my friend? And it's fun. Some of you may watch these YouTube videos where Jordan Klepper or someone else is at a rally and he says, he sort of shows the discrepancies, incoherencies in what people believe. And it's funny. That's the goal. And I just wonder if we don't start with, do you really believe that? And start with, how do you feel? What makes you angry? What makes you sad? What scares you? And tell me how this rally, tell me how this political figure, tell me how this church is a way to kind of reckon with those feelings. And as a scholar of religion, first thing we say, right, at intro to religion class is the fact that, yeah, belief is important, right? But I know Sarah will talk about this later in the conference, but belonging is really important, and feeling and tradition and identity are really, really important, And so I wonder if we might not need to do the fact checking as a means of advancing some sort of way of thinking about how to break through or pierce some sort of silo. And that just seems to me something that is on my mind a lot, because I get asked this question every week. And so have not encountered a sovereign citizen per se. But I had another point on this and I just slipped my mind. On the idea of sovereign citizen, I just want to come back, and I know we're going to wrap up here, to, there's been so much talk about NAR and sort of various instantiations of Pentecostalism, Pentecostal theology. And I think one thing we haven't said yet is that over the course of the life of CNP and what used to be known as the religious right has really been the abandonment in some areas of American conservative Christianity of denominations. And what that does for you is it really gets rid of a lot of bureaucracy, right? You don't have to go through a lot of bureaucracy to figure out who's in charge, or if you want to be in charge, you may not need an MDiv from Yale Divinity, much less could be Dallas Seminary. You don't even need that. And so if you want to break through red tape and bureaucracy, having the ability, right, to anoint apostles and prophets is so quick. It's so efficient. And then to me, and this is not an indictment, please don't, and I know someone will, and I'll get, this will be on Twitter later, but there's a way that if you do away with those structures, that authoritarianism is always going to be a threat, because then you're reliant upon the authority of one leader who has apparently, right, a divine calling, mission, vocation, et cetera, from God. And the hierarchy, the Methodist committee, if you need a Methodist, they're usually in committee, right? Well, that doesn't exist here. And so all of a sudden authoritarianism can pop up very quickly, because all of that kind of structure has been eradicated. And so to me, one of the stories here is the turn to networked churches rather than denominational churches really makes it more expedient to have an authoritarian turn in the kinds of places we're talking about.
Well, I can hardly think of a better transition to our next panel, which will be exactly on this question about authoritarianism. So thank you guys for a great panel. And we'll be back at 3:30.